Good afternoon. It's September 2017. We're just coming out of a USDA report. These comments come with our EU and Black Sea regional WASDE summary. So if you can take the time to print this off, it'll help make sense of some of the comments I'm putting forward today. So starting with European wheat, it was interesting that they've essentially tightened it up even further. And you may well have been expecting that the export number to go down and much of everything else to be left unchanged, and we see our ending stocks grow. But as it turns out, they actually tightened it up a little bit. So that was on the back of, first of all, they reduced the carry-in by 600,000 tonnes. That's not insignificant. It's a pretty decent number. They also reduced the production by almost exactly the same number. So overall, the supply of wheat coming into Europe as we begin our marketing campaign is down 1.3 million tonnes versus where we were a month ago. They've compensated that a little bit on the export number, so they've reduced exports by 1 million tonnes. Overall, our ending stock number gets pulled down to 10 million tonnes versus 10.5 million tonnes last season. And 15.5 million tonnes the season before that. So when you look at European wheat from a carry-out to use ratio perspective, it's as tight as it's been in 10 seasons. So when you look at some of the spreads going on between European wheat values and European cash values, cash markets are really doing a great job of pricing in that tightness. Even the futures, as much as they've fallen, you compare them to Black Sea values or US values, futures values here in Europe are still quite a high premium. So there is a certain amount of this tightness being priced in to wheat prices across Europe and within the European Union. Moving on to the Ukraine, there's not much of a change there. Overall, the ending stocks get pulled down by 400,000 tonnes to 1.8 million. That's down on 2.2 million the season before and 3.3 the season before that. So similar to Europe, the Ukrainian ending stock situation has gotten tighter post this USDA WASDE report. However, the market is very much at the moment fixated on Russia and how big that crop is. And the crop goes from big to bigger, and that was no different in this report. We've jumped from 77.5 million tonnes of production to 81 million tonnes of production. That's a 3.5 million tonne jump, and it's a record level of wheat supply. And we can't ignore that, and the market's certainly not ignoring that fact. But you look at the growing reliance on the world wheat supply for this 17-18 campaign. It's very much focused on that 81 million tonnes of wheat out of Russia. You strip away all the other origins like the Ukraine, like Europe, like the US, it's a much smaller new crop supply outlook by comparison. So the USDA report, this report as it stands right here, is really highlighting the fact that the market is focused on the big supplies of Russian wheat. Interestingly enough, they have bumped up the internal feeding, and that's for some people quite expected, and it is a trend that is an ongoing trend, is the rising feed demand into Russia. But nonetheless, with the higher production number, the increase in exports, which were bumped up by 1 million tonnes, so they took 1 million tonnes from Europe and moved it over to Russia. Their ending stocks jump 1.5 million tonnes to nearly 17 million tonnes. Based on recent history, that's a new high based on recent history for Russian ending stocks. Then if we look at some of the other grain products that are out there, the European maize balance sheet from an ending stock perspective didn't change too much. Carry-in was bumped up. Production was pulled down by 600,000 tonnes, which is not insignificant. And feeding was pulled down by 400,000 tonnes, and that's probably the USDA taking a look at internal EU wheat maize spreads and making a call on that. From a Ukrainian standpoint, of course, they're an important supplier of maize to us here in the European Union. Their production was pulled down by 1 million tonnes from 28.5 to 27.5 versus 28 million tonnes the season before that. So it's up there with, it's smaller, but it's up there with some of the good seasons. So as it stands right now, at face value by the USDA, we're still looking at a reasonably good maize supply outlook from the Ukraine. Then looking quickly at barley, interestingly enough, the ending stocks were left mostly unchanged for the EU from a barley perspective, around 4.6 million tonnes of an ending stock. But that is quite small when you compare it to the 5.5 million tonnes of last season and the 6 million tonnes before that. So the barley balance sheet within the EU is in a contraction phase at the moment, and that's persisting into this report. Finally, if we look at rapeseed, there's not much to change. Production was down very slightly. Carry out reduced very slightly. But a point on the carry out is that the carry out this season, as we project it now for 17-18, is exactly the same as how we ended it last season. So that highlights the importance to us of later on in the campaign, the supply of rapeseed or canola out of Australia. So there are a few of the standout points for us. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us at the usual details. Thank you very much.